Hi there and welcome to the second part of this video. In this video, we were creating a notes application using ASP.NET Core and JavaScript. We will use vanilla JavaScript in this one. And in the previous part, we created a brand new ASP.NET Core web API so that we can hook our JavaScript application, JavaScript client to our ASP.NET Core application and fetch data using the CRUD operations. So we installed Entity Framework Core. We were able to talk to our SQL Server database, and we also created the 5 methods we need. We need the get all notes, get notes by ID. We can add a single note, we can update it, and also we can delete it. So we have created all the 5 functions, and we also tested it in the previous video using Swagger. So everything is working in the backend. It's now time to create a front end. So let's start. To create our front-end application, I will come back to this folder and I will create a new folder. So a new folder which will be called Notes UI or any other name you want to give it. And inside that, I will just open this first in a terminal, and I will open Visual Studio Code here. So code dot, and I can close this PowerShell window now. So once I have Visual Studio Code opened, I can create 2 files, or rather 3 files, one for index.html, style.css, and JavaScript file. So I'll create that really quickly. So I have my 3 files over here. I will first create the HTML structure. So I'm using Emmet extension, which comes in Visual Studio Code by default. So exclamation mark and enter will give you the boilerplate for an HTML page. So the title can be the notes app or any other title that you want to give it. And we'll be creating the HTML structure first. So let's start with that. And I'll also open this in the browser so that we can see what we are building. So this will be opened here and we'll constantly refresh it. So let's come back and add some HTML structure. I will start by linking my styles.css and the script.js inside the HTML. So I will link my style.css file here, and the name should match the file. And I will link my script file at the bottom of the just before the body ends. So script with a source of script.js. So I've linked that. Now it's time to create the HTML structure, and I will first create the container. So div with the class of container, and inside the container I will have a left hand sidebar which will be used as a way to add new notes and to also edit and delete the existing notes, and the notes that are saved in our application will show on the right hand side. So I will have in this container, I will have a sidebar. So div with the class of notes underscore sidebar, and I will have another one of this which will be, let's say, just notes container. So now we want to work on the sidebar first and also on other stuff. So let's start with the container, and let's start with the styles first. So for all the elements, I will remove any padding and margin. So I'll say margin of 0 and padding of 0, and I will say box sizing of border box, and I will also give it a font style. So font style, or maybe a font family of let's say Verdana. Save that, and after that I will work on the body. I will say the body to have a width of 100% and a height of 100 VH, which is the full screen height of the browser, and I think that's it. And after that I can work on this container element. So I will say container that will have again a width of 100% and a height of 100 VH. So taking all the screen width over here. After that, we will work on the notes sidebar. So let's create a style for that, which will be on this side. Let's say it takes around 400 pixels. So width of 400 and then height of 100 VH. So it takes the full height. And let's put something on the side of this. So let's say a border right. Border right of 2 pixels solid, some color of gray, like that. And we don't have anything inside, so let's add some stuff inside the sidebar. So for the sidebar, we will add a few things. Let's say the first input text box will be for the title. So I'll say an input of type text, and that'll have an ID of title, and the that should be it. And the next one would be a text area, and that will basically have an ID of description. And we can change the ID later on as well, but just for the beginning. We will also have a button which will say save, which will be treated as a way to add and update the notes as well. We'll work on the delete button later on, but let's see how this is looking like. We have this at the moment, so let's style them. And it's not showing the CSS. I mean, it's applying the CSS, but you know, you can't see the side border over here. Let's see. So for the notes, I will come back to styles. So notes sidebar, I will have this dot input and take 100% of the width for the input, and similarly for the text area as well. Let's refresh that. So it's working. 400 pixels can be too much, but let's see how it works. I'll give a padding of around 50 pixels over here so that, you know, we have something in the center. So 50 pixel padding on the notes sidebar makes stuff in the center. Let's see why I gave it a border radius. Instead, I have to give it a border. So 2 pixels solid this. So this is working, but I have to give it a right border only. So it only shows on the right hand side over here. So that's looking nice. We have an area which we can use to add a new note. And we can have placeholder over here saying, for the input area, we'll have the placeholder saying add title. And for the text area, we'll have the placeholder saying add description. Now for the input, I will have a margin bottom of let's say 10 pixels, and same for the text area. And we will also have another one which will be a style for the button, and this will basically not have the width but a margin bottom. So let's see how this is looking like. I'll give the text the font size to both of them as well. So font size of 13 pixels to this and the text area as well. Refresh that. That looks good. Now we need to style the input. I'll give it a padding of 10 pixels from, let's say, overall, and same to the text area. Refresh that again. That's looking much better. Maybe also add a maximum width of this text area so that it doesn't overflow. So a max width of 100%. And for this button, I will basically say the outline to be none and the border to be none. And I will give a background color of a dark black color. So 353535. And I will give it a color of white. So FFF. Let's see how it's looking like. And I will give some paddings to it now. So a padding of 10 pixel top and bottom and 20 pixels left and right. Give it a border radius as well of around 3 pixels. Save that, and that's how it's looking like. So we have our stuff on the sidebar defined. We'll put a cursor over here on the button as well. So cursor of pointer. And now it's time to work on this side of the section which shows the notes. So I'll do the same thing. I'll add a padding of 50 pixels to that side as well. So I will first create the style for the container over here, and I will say padding of 50 pixels all around, and then I will start working on the individual notes inside it. So I will say they will be a div with the class of note, and each note will have an h3 tag which will say this is the title, and then we'll have a paragraph with some text in it. So this is how a note would look like. This is a big note, and we'll probably have another just a dummy one which says this is the description. So a note with some little text and some more text. So save that, and if we refresh it, they are coming over here because we need to give some styles to the container. So let's come back and give some styles to this container, and we will say display this as a flex, and we want the flex direction to be row, which is by default as well. And then we have given the width over here. We want to give the flex property of 1 to the notes container, which is on the right hand side. So if I refresh this, it comes back over here, and you can see the 50 pixel padding applied over here, and nothing is getting to the second page, or we don't see a scroll bar, so that's good. Finally, we want these notes to be like notes, they're individual boxes. So let's work on that. So let's work on the note style, the element, and the note will have a background color first, which will be something around a light color, so EEE, and then they'll have a padding of 30 pixels. Let's say we can change this anytime. Now we want it to be one on side of each other. So let's give the notes container a display of flex, and then flex direction of row, and also a flex wrap of wrap, so that when there's enough, once you have all the notes coming here, and they will then come into the second line. We will also give a width to the note. So let's say width is 25%, whereas the notes container had a width of 100%. Save that and see if it is working. Yep, which it is. It's coming on one on the side. We just don't want to take the entire space because I think it's working in align with this. So we'll come back to the container and we'll say justify, or rather align items. Let's see if we do flex start, and that works nicely. So you can see it's only taking enough space as the text, and we can even work on that to show a maximum height of a note. So let's say we have a maximum height of 300 pixels, maybe 200, and then an overflow of auto. Save that, and you can see if this is bigger, it'll automatically add a scroll bar. And we only want to add a scroll bar to the text area, not to the title as well. So we'll not add it over here, but we'll add it to the text area. But before the text area, let's work on the title, which is the h3 tag. And similarly, we'll have something for the text area, which is a paragraph. I'm just saying text area, it's actually a paragraph. So we'll add the overflow property over here, overflow of auto. Save that, refresh it, and now if I reduce the height to 200 pixels, it's actually overflowing. Now I can say overflow of hidden onto the note, so that this is hidden. And now we want to add some a scroll bar to this paragraph. So it's actually the maximum height for the paragraph should be 200 pixels. Refresh that, and you can see we have a scroll bar just for the paragraph over here. We do want to add some margin because they are sitting one on top of each other. We do want to add some margins, so I'll say margin of 10 pixels, or margin bottom of 10 pixels, and similarly for the paragraph as well. Let's refresh, and we want to give some font size. So font size of 13 pixels. H3 is fine. Let's give it to the paragraph, and looking much better. We want to add a margin right to notes so that we have some separation between notes. So I'll say margin right of 10 pixels, or maybe more. Let's say 30 pixels. Yep. And when you'll add more notes, it'll just come down. If I show you, I'll copy this note field from here a few more times, and if I refresh it, I should see the notes just being carried down. But we don't have a margin bottom, so it's a good point to add one margin bottom of 30 pixels as well. Now you can see they are having a good separation between them, and we can also align them to the center by saying to the notes container that the justify content property to center. So that makes them to center as well. So this is looking good. Now it's time for some other stuff, which is JavaScript related stuff. We have to fetch the data from the API, and we also want to save some notes from this form over here. So let's start with the saving of the form. So let's come back to the to our code, and in the script we'll start with adding a function. So we'll add a function called add note, and this will basically take a few things. It wants the title, it wants this description, so let's give it title description, and it wants to talk to the API to save it. So, and how are we gonna save it? We're gonna use the fetch function. So we'll say the fetch API, it needs a URL, and the URL for our application, if we go back to Swagger, it is running on localhost 7124. So I'll copy this slash, and if I look at the posts API, which is /API/notes, which is the add functionality, so I'll say /API/notes, and after that it needs some options, like for example the method name, method post, or method type names and all that. So let's say start with the method. The method would be post, then it needs a body, and we'll create the body over here. So we'll say const body is equal to, it's a JavaScript object, and we'll say the body needs stuff like this. It needs the title, description, and is visible property. So let's start with the title. The title is coming from the title over here. Then we need the description, which is coming from the method parameter as well. And there's the is visible property, which is, we will set it to true by default because we want to show the note on the screen. So the body will be passed as JSON. So we will say JSON.stringify we'll pass the body object, and after that we'll also pass some headers, just one, which will be an object, and we will say content hyphen type is application/JSON, and we'll basically make a post call with this body to this URL, and because fetch returns a promise, we'll capture that in the then. We'll say data, and we'll convert it to JSON first, data.json, and after that we will log this response, console log the response. And we need to call this function, right? We have created this, but we haven't called it. So we want to call this when we hit this save button. So let's actually first get the save button and then add an event listener. So I'll create a constant over here on the top, say save button, which is document.querySelector. And let's get this from the ID. Hopefully we have given it an ID. We might have not. So let's say the ID is button save. Save that and then pass the ID over here. Now you want to create an event listener. I'll create event listener over here. So I'll say this dot add event listener. It's of type click. It's a click event listener, and it runs a function. And we'll say when this is clicked, you want to add a note. So I will call this function. It needs a title and description, which we will get from these two fields over here. Now we want to get the values of these two fields. So let's create two more constants. And the first one will be title input, and the second one will be description input. And using the IDs, we will get that. So title and description. We'll say title and description. So using the title and description, we will get the values inside the event listener. We'll say this dot, or we can say, we can just pass it directly. We can say title dot value, comma, description input dot value. So we will call this add note method when the save button is clicked. So let's see if that is working all correct or not. I will refresh this page first. I will open the developer tools, open console, and make sure your API is running. So I'll refresh Swagger. We have one note at the moment. So let's add another. So I will say this is second note, and this is the description. If I click on the save button now, you can see we got some error, and this was expected because we are getting a course error. It says that the same origin policy disallows reading the resource at the API location. This means that the browser is actually blocking any requests to this API because the server doesn't allow any other client to access it. So what do we have to do? We have to come back to our ASP.NET Core Web API to actually enable course. So we'll do that. We'll come back to our API. We'll first stop it. And in the program.cs file over here, in the section where it says configure the HTTP request pipeline, we will come to this line and we will say app.useCourse, and it takes some parameters. We will say, sorry, I'll just type it again, app.useCourse, and it takes policy. So I will give it policy options such that policy dot allow any origin dot allow any header and also allow any method. So what we are trying to say here is this API will now accept any header, any method, and any origin coming from the World Wide Web basically. So now our API is ready to take some calls. If I run it again, now our JavaScript client should be able to talk to our API. So I'm just waiting for this to run, and if I refresh Swagger, this is running as well. So I'll come back without doing anything. I'll just hit that save button again, and this time we should be able to save it. So if I click save, you can see the object returned back, and this was the response from the fetch API. You can see the description. We have a new ID of the node as well, the other two properties. So if we come back to Swagger and try to get all the nodes again, this time we should have a couple of more, because in the meantime I did another one, but you get the point. So we are actually allowing our API to accept calls from the clients, and now we are able to save it. So I'll close this, and now we will actually not display these nodes which were hard-coded. We'll actually make a get call to the API on page load, so that we are able to get the nodes from the API. So I'll come back to my application for that, and on page load I want to get the nodes. So I'll create a function first. I'll say get all nodes, or just get nodes maybe, and inside here I'll create a fetch API call again. So using fetch API, I will pass the URL. The URL will be the same for the HTTP get call for the nodes, and here we will say fetch on this URL and return the promise. When you do it, we are going to convert it to JSON first. So I'll copy that and then console log the response over here. So function is created. It's now time to call it. So on page load, I'll just use it over here. I'll call the function like that. And if I refresh this and open my console, you can see three nodes coming back from the API, from the database, and you can see all the properties and the values for all the three nodes. So now it's time to iterate on this array and actually show the data over here. I will open my project again, and I will delete all the other nodes that I have over here. I will just keep this one just for demonstration, and I don't even need that because I know it's a div of node h3 and p. That's all I need for now. So I'll remove the container. This is empty. We'll just use the array that is coming back. So now I will create another method which will display the nodes. So we'll say function display nodes, and it basically takes all the nodes. Let's pass the nodes in here, and when you get all the nodes, after getting them, instead of logging the response, I will just say display nodes, and I will pass that array that's coming back to the display nodes function. So I'll move this over here, and now it's time to work on the display nodes. So I will first want to iterate on this array. So I will say nodes dot for each. So nodes dot for each the node, such that I want to add values to this node field. So I want to create elements over here. So I will create a string first. Let's use these, and I will create a div. Now as if you remember, the div had a class of node. and then inside the note there was an h3. Now the h3 will have the title over here, so I will say the note dot title. So the h3 will have this value, and after that h3 will have the paragraph, and the paragraph will have the value of note dot description. So we will create the structure like this, and then we want to append this to this container over there. So after iterating on each field, we want to basically add or append this string. So let's say this is a constant of element, note element is equal to the string over here. So I can just format this and put it over here like this. So this is the note element. Now I want to append this into the container over here. So let's get the container first. So I will use the same theory. I want to get the container, so I'll put the same as ID is equal to this, and the ID is this. This is the notes container. Now I'll select the notes container and say this dot inner HTML is equal to note element. I'll pull this back like this and save it. If I come here and refresh this, you can see there's only one note added over here, and the reason for that is it's the third one, because it's always changing the inner HTML of the note. So we don't have all the elements, we just have the last element. So we want to basically have another string which gets appended with all the elements first, and then we assign the inner HTML. So we will have another one, let's say const, or maybe a let, because we want to change it, all notes is equal to empty string to begin with, and then we say this is equal to the note element. And finally, outside of the loop, we want to update the inner HTML of the container to actually display all the notes elements. So we'll say all notes, save that, and if I refresh this now, we see all the notes coming in over here. So that portion is working as well. We are able to get all the notes, and we are able to save a note from here as well. The one thing we are not doing at the moment is this is not clearing. So let's do that. For that, we already have the title and input. We can create another function called clear form, and let's say function clear form will basically clear the value. So value is equal to empty, and similarly we'll also clear the value for the description. So refresh that and add another note, third note, and description, save that. Nothing changes over here and not even here. So let's see why. Because we are not calling the clear form anywhere. So after adding the note in the function, we want to, we are not even displaying anything, right? So in here, instead of logging this, we want to clear the form when it's a success, and also to get all the notes again, because we have added something, we want to do it again. So now it's time to refresh this again. you can see the fourth node, the third node was added. So we'll do another one, fourth node. This is some description. Save that, and you can see this is getting clear, and you also see the notes over here. If you want to also add time to it, when this was created, you can add time and you can sort it over here. It's totally up to you of how you do it. But our add functionality is working. Our showing all the notes functionality is working. The thing left now is, if we click on this note, we want to populate this form again so that we can update it. Or if we click this form again, we should be having a delete button over here somewhere from which we can delete that note. So let's work on these two functionalities first. So we'll start with populating this form first. So we have to somehow have an event listener when this box is clicked or when the note is clicked. We want to populate this form back. So when we are displaying the notes, we want to add event listeners for all the notes. So after this inner HTML update, we want to add event listener, something like that. And then we will use the note class to basically get all the notes. So we will say document.querySelector all, and we'll pass the class which is note, and this will return a list of elements, which is, for example, 5 over here. We will say for each, because that was a list, for each of them, let's say item or note, we want to add event listeners to each of them. So we will say note.add event listener. On the click of them, execute this function. And let's just start by giving an alert pop-up. So save that and refresh it. If I click it, we see an alert box over here. So that means our event listeners are working fine for notes. It's now time to populate this back to this form. So we can create a function again for this, and let's say function populate form, which will take the title and description. It also needs an ID because it wants to know what is the ID of it, which is the unique identifier, because later on we'll use this ID to delete and other stuff as well. So we'll keep the ID handy for now. And populate form will basically populate the value of the text input from the title. We'll do the same to the description input over here, and then we'll keep the ID handy, as I said. So we will use this populate form when the event listener activates or when it's clicked. We will send some details from the clicked form. But what is the detail? We want to add another thing to the node, which is here, which is the data property. So we want to give it a data property, which is a data attribute like data-id, which will be the unique identifier for the node, and it's actually coming to us inside the node as well. So we will say $note.id. So that's the unique identifier. If I save it and refresh this, I can show it to you. Right click, inspect. If I come to any node, you can see the data ID being populated, and it's a unique GUID identifier. So now we will use this GUID, and inside here we will say before populating the form, we want to say well, note dot, because that's the complete selection. We don't even need that E. Note dot attributes dot, I can actually say note dot data set dot, we gave it the ID over here, so ID, and let's alert this one to see if it's actually giving us the ID. Save that, refresh it, click on that, it's giving us the ID which ends with FA. For this one, it's a different one, so it's working fine. So we have the ID over here, and we'll pass this ID to the populate form. We also have the description and other stuff. We can store it here, or we can actually just pass the ID and make a call again to fetch the latest values coming from the API. So what we'll do is we'll pass the ID property in the populate form, and over here in the populate form we don't need to set the title and description, so we'll only receive the ID. And from this ID we will actually call another method which actually talks to the API and fetch the note again for us. So we'll say get note by ID and pass the ID to it. So we'll create this method, and we will say get note by ID, and this is basically a fetch method as well. So I will use the get all notes. I will copy the response from here. So we will have to give the ID of the note that we want to fetch. So I will first convert this, and then in the route I will have the $sign and curly braces, and I will pass the ID that we want, which is coming in as a parameter to this function. So we will make a get call to this API URL and then convert that to JSON, and then we will finally, when we receive the data, we will populate the form. We have that already, but we'll say display note in form, and we'll pass the response in here. So now we want to create this function display note in form. We will create another function, and in here we will receive a note, and we want to say the title input dot value will be note dot value, and then the description input dot value will be equal to note dot description. And after that we'll see that these two things have been populated. So if I refresh it, if I click on it, you can see this is coming as undefined. I don't know why. This is not value, this should be title. Save that and refresh again. So if I click on second note, it shows the value and the description, the title and the description, but this time it's coming from the API. We want to add something new. Let's say this is the third note, some description, and we'll save that. So this is getting saved. Now we want to populate this again. So we'll say this is the third note and this is the second note. So it's coming back and populating the form again. So it's good. We just need a delete button over here, which we can use to delete that selected note. So let's come back to our HTML. And in the HTML, we will have another button. So I'll copy and paste this. The ID would be button delete. The value is delete, and I will give it two classes. One will be a button delete class, which will be a style class. So let's style this. Let's say this is the button delete. I'll give it a background color of some red color, which we have over here. So copy that and save it. I'll give the important property so that it overrides the original one. If I refresh it, you can see the delete button is over here now, but we don't want to see this all the time. We only want to see this when a note is selected. For example, if it's an empty form, we don't want to see the delete button. So I'll have another CSS style of hidden. So this class will say display none, and I will give this hidden class to this button. So when the app is loaded and there's no selected note, we will not see that button because that's hidden. And when the note is selected, we want to see that delete button. So on the select of the note, which is let's find it out, which is over here. This is the add event listener. We want to say populate this form, and inside the populate form we can have another thing, which is get node by ID. Let's see where that is, and display note in form. So in here we want to say the button. So let's select the button, which is similar to this, and I'll call this delete button with an ID of button delete. So this delete button dot class list dot remove the hidden class, which we have given to that button by default. So when we remove it, it will become visible again. So save that change, and if I select it, you can see the button now getting enabled, and you are getting the latest note information from the API as well. So now we have to work on this delete button. So in here I will add an event listener for the delete button. I'll say add button dot add event listener. It's of type click, and we want to run this function. On this function we want to call the delete note method, and I want to pass an ID to that method because I want to tell the API which note to delete by ID. So let's get the ID first. We don't have the ID in scope at the moment, so when we click this note, we will also give the data ID to this button. So when we are in the add event listener, sorry, not in the add events listener, but when we remove the class, we have the ID of the selected node in here. So we will say delete button dot set attribute, which is the data.id attribute, and the value is node.id. We save that, we give the data ID attribute, and now we can use the data ID attribute over here in the delete node. So we will say, and this is the delete button, not the add button. We will say the delete button dot dataset dot ID is the ID that is selected, and now we can use this ID and pass to this method. So we want to create a delete note method, and this takes the ID of the note as a parameter, and it'll call the fetch API again. So I'll use this method. I'll copy the fetch call, and I'll come back to the delete node. The fetch call also takes the ID for the delete method, so I will pass the ID as a route, which is like this. The method type would be delete, and then we don't have to pass the body, and the headers are this. The response JSON, the data will be converted to JSON, and then the response can be logged to console. So let's see if that is working all fine or not. So I will come over here, refresh the application, and also open the console. I will select the third note, and if I click on this note button, delete button, it gives us an error. And the reason for that is that we are trying to convert the data to JSON, but if you remember the API, the delete method doesn't pass any data. It just gives a 200 success response without any data. So we don't have anything to convert, and that's why it's throwing the error. So I'll delete this line, and now instead of consoling it, I can console it to the log and see. So we are left with just one. So I'll select this node and click on the delete button. It comes back with a 200 response. That means it was successful, and the body is empty. This has been deleted as well, but we don't have anything in place to refresh this. So I'll add a new note to just say this is the new note, and instead of consoling it, we want to clear the form and refresh this page again. So the clear form currently clears the input title and the description. We'll also disable the button or make it hidden. So class list dot add the hidden class again, and along with that I also want to get all the notes again. So in the delete here, I will say clear form and then get all notes. So save that, and if I refresh it, and let's add another note. So save that, we have two notes. If I delete one note, if I delete it, it clears the form completely. We don't see the delete button again, and it refreshes the list of notes that we have on screen. So that's working as well. So if I refresh, it's the same. Finally, when we select the note, we also have the option to update this using the save button. So let's create the update functionality. I'll come back to my application, and this is the save button event listener, and it's basically adding the node, but we don't want to add a node, we want to update a node. So let's first create the update node method, and let's create it over here. So function update node, this would take the ID, this would take the title, and also take the description, and it will make a call, a fetch call again, so we can use the add note thing. So we'll copy the body and the fetch method as well, and save that over here. Come back to the update node. So the body will have title, description, and is visible, and the URL, which is the route for that, will also contain the ID of the node that we are trying to update. So ID over here, the method would be the put method to update. We are sending the body as JSON, so JSON.stringify body, and the headers are the same as well. So when we get back the data, we'll convert that to JSON, and then we'll use that response to clear the form and again make a call to the get all nodes. So that's all working fine and should remain the same. We'll come back to the update node. So on the save method, we have the update node field ready. So we want to call add sometimes and sometimes update, but that should depend on whether this save button has an ID or not. But it doesn't have an ID because only the delete button has the data ID. So let's also give the save button the data ID. So in the display node inform, when this node is selected, we want to give a data ID property to this button as well. So let's copy paste this, and instead of the delete button, we want the save button as well to have the data ID property, which should be the ID of the node we are trying to update. So save that, and in here, when we want to update, or when we are actually clicking on the save button, we want to first check const ID is equal to this dot data set dot ID. If ID is defined, then we call the update node method, which takes the ID and which takes the title value and the description, which will be the updated values. Else we call the add node because it's a new node, we don't have the ID for it available, so call the add node instead, and everything else would remain the same. In the update node, we are also refreshing the list again, just confirming. Yeah, so if I come back to refresh this application, if I select this and say this has been updated, and this as well, and save it. We can see the form gets cleared, the delete button is hidden, and you can also see the note has been updated as well. So it's all working fine now. We have if we refresh the application again, just to give you a tour of this application, it's now complete with the functionality. We have implemented the CRUD operations inside JavaScript, and this JavaScript client-side application is talking to our ASP.NET Core Web API. So we can see all the notes. We can add a new note. Like that, and we can see all the notes. If you want to select a note, you can click on the note, and if you want to delete a note, you can just hit this delete button and it gets deleted. If you want to update a note and click on save, that works as well. So our functionality is now complete. I hope you liked this video and learned something from it. If you did, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel to get more amazing content like this one. Thank you for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.